Pour la question française, pourquoi les pays fourniraient-ils des subventions aux combustibles fossiles aux consommateurs quand ils l'ont convenu lors de la conférence sur le changement climatique 26, de les éliminer progressivement?
Bon, merci pour la question, Ryan. Alors, les subventions sont perçues comme faussant la demande des consommateurs parce qu'elles rendent le produit moins cher que ce que dit le marché. Mais nombreux gouvernements et aussi nombreux gouvernements se sont engagés lors de la COP26 de les éliminer progressivement pour faire avancer les politiques climatiques, comme vous dites. Mais dans le cas de l'énergie, du pétrole et du gaz, quand c'est essentiel au bien-être matériel des gens, pour la nourriture, pour le transport, pour le chauffage, cela s'apparente à subventionner le logement ou la nourriture. C'est donc un énorme problème politique, en particulier dans les pays les plus pauvres, pour le gouvernement de supprimer ces subventions, parce que cela a un impact direct sur le bien-être des gens. Parce qu'il n'y a pas d'autre option fiable et affordable. Il est souvent conduit dans le passé et ça va intensifier, je pense, à nouveau. Et aussi, on va avoir des troubles civils. C'est déjà arrivé en Kazakhstan où le gouvernement a reçu un coup parce qu'ils ont éliminé certaines de ces subventions. Alors, c'est un grand problème. So for everyone else, why do governments subsidize fossil fuels? Even though we said at COP26 it's bad, and from an economic perspective, it is a bad intervention. The market says it should be something. If you subsidize it, then the supply-demand balance never happens in the market. So from that perspective, it is inefficient. However, why do you do it? Why do you subsidize housing? Why do you subsidize school lunches? It's because people need it to live. You cannot live without oil and gas. We cannot live without oil and gas yet. So the poorest people that need that energy, need that oil and gas, can't afford it, almost require as a right, it's the right to the material well-being, that it becomes more affordable. And so that's why governments frequently subsidize oil and gas. And that's why it's a huge problem to eliminate it, because the problem is chicken and the egg. Do you make oil and gas more expensive so that renewables and low carbon sources can replace them? But in that intervening period, you just don't have enough supply. So we've taken a supply first approach, and now that looks like maybe it's a mistake, and we should focus on a demand first approach again. The answer is both. If we could switch to renewables faster and cheaper and easier, we would do it. That is the solution, but it's still so expensive. So right now, the option isn't between renewable and non-renewable. It's between cheap and expensive. And that's the problem. People do not want to pay more for energy. And because we all rely on it for our well-being, it's not a great social science policy to make energy more expensive. So what do I think is going to happen in Canada? I think that carbon tax, especially as it grows higher, because at $1.50 a liter, people are not driving for fun much anymore anyways. Of course, maybe 10% of people, it doesn't matter. They still buy their SUV, but it's already affecting people's habits. So what we call, if you're in economics, we call it inelasticity. That I mostly only have as much heat in my house. I don't put it up to 28. I heat it as much as it's comfortable. It's all at 21, right? So if you're having to go to 16, 15 degrees, which people are, you're not as comfortable. There are some costs to that. There's well-being costs to that. So I think the carbon tax would be the easiest thing to remove, and people know that because it's new. And so that's where a climate policy is directly going to hit an economic policy. People are talking about it in their neighborhood Facebook groups, that carbon tax. They're feeling that even if it's all returned, and the policy is pretty good when they return it all, you are trying to disincentivize people from using energy. And people people aren't using energy for fun in most cases. So I think that carbon tax, if you're removing VAT, in Europe, and you're directly subsidizing it, I don't know how Canada keeps adding on, a non-market measure to disincentivize energy, but I guess we'll see. And part of it is because you saw in that one chart that this hits actually Atlantic Canada the hardest because they are more reliant on oil. They don't have the hydro and they don't have the nuclear. And in the West, certainly in Saskatchewan, Alberta, we rely more on natural gas, but we also produce it, like the cost is the benefit. We benefit from high natural gas prices because we get revenues and royalties and incomes, benefit in other ways. So it's really Atlantic Canada that hurts the most. And of course, in Quebec, they have fantastic resources of hydro. So does BC. Ontario has some hydro. Manitoba has hydro. So they aren't getting the same carbon tax on their bills, I guess, as we're seeing in other parts. So that's where I think the regional discussion is going to matter more. But in terms of the balance of power, where Atlantic Canada has been so heavily liberal, removing their support does change the dynamics of federation a lot. So I think that will be very interesting. So there's some reports like the ISD, says that Canada subsidizes fossil fuel sector a tremendous amount, but it really depends how do you define subsidy. So normally, an economist would define it as a direct, giving money. Whereas the ISD is saying it's, a tax credit. So if you had to pay less tax credit or deferred tax credit, that would be a subsidy. They say the government buying TMX is a tax subsidy, even though it's purchasing an asset and it will sell that asset. And they say government providing finance to the Bank of Canada or the Development Bank, the Economic Development Bank, the EDC, providing finance, as a loan with interest that gets repaid. They are also counting that as a subsidy. So you could get rid of some of those things. I guess oil and gas, the industry is making a tremendous amount of money now, and they are almost like they're paying off their debts at a tremendous rate. So they probably don't need that EDC financing anyways, or they get in the private market. So maybe you could do that, but it's not a consumer subsidy. There are no consumer subsidies for fossil fuels in Canada. But like I said before, in a lot of developed countries, and now you're seeing in Japan and elsewhere, there are direct consumer fossil fuel subsidies. So Canada doesn't have that, so it's going to be hard for us to get rid of those. And the other ones aren't really subsidies, and the oil and gas industry doesn't really need that hand up. A big one used to be the tax credits because the upfront capital investment of mines and oil sands was tremendous. So as an investor, you had to pay so much upfront, and it takes a long time to get your money back. But they're starting to get their money back now. So we're even seeing royalty rates go up higher, that kind of a thing. So the oil industry doesn't depend a lot. The only areas there's no subsidies to get rid of. You might get rid of some tax credits. Those tax credits are basically not unique to oil and gas. They're consistent across all sectors. The one where they're introducing a tax credit is carbon capture. And I think that's actually a fantastic idea. The Liberals want to introduce it to some extent. And in the United States and Norway, they have much more generous actual subsidies of carbon capture, utilization, storage. And I think if we care about climate change, we don't care if it's the fossil fuel. Like, if you want to get rid of emissions, then subsidize getting rid of emissions. So there's nothing to get rid of, but there's some things that we could add, I think. I mean, I follow energy Twitter. I don't know if you guys do it. And one of it is for buying stocks, like when should you buy, when should you sell? And I wish all you guys had been buying stocks, in March 2020, because none of you would have to go to school anymore. You'd just be retired now. Same with me. But anyway, so part of it might be for investment, but the EIA, the US EIA, Energy Information Association, their monthly and their weekly, talking about crude draws and oil rigs, so you can get that from EIA. The IEA, the International Energy Association, which is mostly paid for by oil importing countries, plus the United States and Canada. They have great information, although people think they're, a little too climate friendly in that they don't have realistic projections anymore. They're always optimistic that we're going to get rid of oil demand faster than we are. And then OPEC has its own predictions, which kind of gives they have an incentive to see more oil demand. So they tend to see higher global oil demand. So those are really good sources, I guess, of that kind of information. In terms of the security crisis kind of a thing, I mean, that's just in the news right now every day. So I mean, if Ukraine goes to war with Russia, if Russia goes to war with Ukraine, I should say, it'll be in the news every day and you won't be able to avoid it. And I think in a year, we're all going to be experts in energy, like we're all experts in COVID-19 pandemic epidemiology today. We're all going to be so much more aware of energy because it's going to be affecting our pocketbooks. I feel like it's going to be more balanced because we could live in a vacuum where there weren't any trade-offs to someone like me. It was like, of course I want better climate policies. Of course I want a carbon tax when it was theoretical. But now that there's an energy crisis and there isn't enough supply coming online and the price have to go up. There's nowhere else for them to go unless we suddenly stop using as much energy as we used to. And there's no reason to think with another billion Asian and African people on this planet that we will. That energy is going to get more expensive. So we are just going to have to start considering that. I think energy policy was like a subsector of climate policy in Canada since 2015. And now we're seeing in Europe first, and we're seeing it everywhere else. Energy policy matters, security policy matters, and it can't just be climate policy. We have to balance all these things. So Canada will be the last to feel this brunt. People are already feeling this brunt elsewhere, but it'll hit us pretty soon, I think, in the next year. And we'll have to have a more balanced conversation. So OPEC if you guys understand OPEC, they've actually played a pretty good role in that they really balance out the supply and the demand, that they can control very easily, produce a bit more, produce a bit less, and they meet every month to decide that. And it is in their interest and it's their stated mandate to keep it stable. No one likes this. And they also don't want to have demand destruction. They don't want, if oil hits $200 a barrel, we will be burning wood more. You know what I mean? Like we will be going to other sources. Solar and wind and geothermal and nuclear will start to look pretty good at $200 a barrel. So it's not their interest to have oil go that high. They do want to produce more. I think though that we've never confronted the problem where there might not be enough supply. And maybe, and then maybe the market and we'll find, we'll have another shale revolution in some kind of technology or something. But right now there isn't a lot of private investment for that. We're already having supply chain issues. There's already, a lot of labor shortage in that sector. There isn't a great amount of knowledge in that sector. It's, there's climate policies that disincentivize investing in oil and gas. So it's scary. It's actually, if you look at the inventories and you look at the production coming online, you look at the capital expenditures going into it, and you look at demand, it's not the same. It is not the same. So be grateful that you're in Canada. If you're in Alberta, be grateful that you're in Alberta, and get a hybrid car. Honestly, if you can find one, it takes 9 months to get one, but I can't see this crisis going anywhere.
You said obviously this energy crisis is just getting started, and it won't be going anywhere anytime soon. But as far as solutions to it, what do you think needs to be done from a change in attitude perspective? Do we simply need to say we need to invest more in our oil and gas industry? Is it really that simple, or is it a multitude of things?
It's a multitude of things, and great question. I think pragmatism will hit, when our allies are facing civil unrest because of energy crises. They will want Canada to keep producing. And in the long term, people say it, and I'm Canadian, we're biased, but the last drop of oil should be a Canadian drop of oil. You know what I mean? And to some extent, that's true. We don't ever want to be in a situation where only Russia and Saudi Arabia and Iran are exporting oil, and we still need petroleum products, even if we stop burning it. And I hope we do. We still need, plastic demand is growing. It is going to keep growing at a rapid pace. We still need that material. There's still going to be another billion human beings on the planet. So that's not going anywhere. But I want you guys to be aware. So if we do transition to renewables, at some point we will. If we have no more nuclear, more hydro, more solar, some more wind, all that relies on mining. All of that relies on mining, and we do not have the mining supply. And that's, now the International Energy Association looks at mining supply of lithium, of graphite, of nickel, of rare earths. We need 5, 6, 7, 8 times of a lot of those, battery products, let alone for our computers, and our satellites and everything else. So there's a gap in supply of oil. The same gap exists in mining right now. They had the same overinvestment in commodities has led to underinvestment the last decade, and it has not caught up. And it's not, investors still aren't. And it's still hard. It takes 10 to 15 years in Canada to build a mine from the day you seek approvals until you get until it's producing. And here's the last thing I'll say about that. Oil and gas is actually very competitive in that it's almost everywhere in the world. Too bad for Asia a little bit. Actually, China's, I think, the 4th largest producer. They just consume so much they don't export any. So oil and gas is almost everywhere. Graphite isn't everywhere. Rare earths aren't everywhere. Cobalt isn't everywhere. Nickel isn't everywhere. And so you're going to have 4 or 5 countries controlling 20 minerals that are each critical to a renewable transition. And how are you going to coordinate all that? So you're going from one product, oil, with some natural gas and coal, obviously important, but you could just do it with oil, into having to have 20 different minerals to make your battery. And they're concentrated in a handful of countries. So the energy complications the security implications are just going to get worse when we move off of oil and gas, unfortunately.